Hi, so my name is Patrick Lyons. I am a graduate student in the Department of French at the University of California, Berkeley. And this talk is titled Staging Disappearance, Retrieving Memory of the Nanterre Bidonville. So my remarks today will address the policing of memory and literary form as they relate to the protracted dispossession of residents of the La Folie bidonville in Nanterre by the forces of the French state during and after the Algerian War. I will reflect upon these topics as represented in the activist Monique Hervault's diaristic work, Chronique du bidonville, Nanterre en guerre d'Algérie. Hervault's journal recounts the years 1959 to 1962 of a 12-year or so period spent living and working at La Folie in solidarity with its less electively placed inhabitants, at one point over 10,000 men, women, and children, overwhelmingly immigrants and largely Algerian. Hervault published her account belatedly in 2012 with the preface by her publisher, François Maspereau. 40 years earlier, in 1971, Maspereau had published Hervault's first and long out of print work drawn from her experience, Bidonville, l'enlisement, an ethnographic enquête co-written by Marie-Ange Charras. The existence of the Nanterre bidonville roughly corresponds to the period known in France as the Trente Glorieuses, that is the span of exponential capitalist growth and development from around 1945 to 1975. As Abdelmalek Sayad puts it in his study on Nanterre Algérien, the Nanterre bidonville became most visible in the mid-1950s, proliferating as a response to the insufficiency of state and industry-run worker foyers intended to house immigrant workers called up into national reconstruction projects. Soon, Algerian-run cafes in Nanterre began to double as overcrowded hotels, building informal extensions which spidered outwards into alleyways and nearby vacant fields to house incoming workers. Over time, this expansion led to the construction of vast labyrinthine networks of tin-roofed shacks and barracks with a complex internal economy. Real estate markets, cafes, grocers, and the like constituted a private shadow economic nexus in the margins of French society. Many accounts testify to the scarcity of both water and reliable electricity in the bidonville, the former fetched from a few distant spigots known as the corvées d'eau, and the latter jury-rigged into a precarious, fire-hazardous web of wires crisscrossing the settlement. Hervault testifies to both conditions in La Folie in her book, and the immense strain it placed upon families that lived there. Yet it is her publisher, Maspereau, who draws Hervault's project more succinctly into the terms suggested by this conference, spaces of memory, the political bent of commemoration, or what Anne Stoller aptly names colonial aphasia in France. In his preface to Chronique du bidonville, Maspereau considers, like so many others, the imperial blind spots of Pierre Nora's Les lieux de mémoire. I cite, "On cherchera en vain la mémoire de la colonisation de l'Algérie," he writes. "Comme on dit, circuler, il n'y a rien à voir." The policing of national memory suggested in Maspereau's formulation, keep moving, nothing to see here, sets the tone for my comments today, whereas the end of his statement sets the place. Et si lentement, enfin, ressurgit aujourd'hui la mémoire de ces années noires, que reste-t-il de celle des bidonvilles? As a recent investigation by Léopold Lambert with the Funambulist Journal has shown, little stands to commemorate the Nanterre bidonville at the site where they once stood. Instead, only a few vacant patches of land remain between a police prefecture and the headquarters of an insurance company. To restrict the horizons of this broad subject, memory, forgetting, and La Folie, my comments will focus primarily on policing. I'm sure you can see this. Material policing in the Nanterre bidonville, and more broadly in terms of the policing of history. This and what literature, in particular this personal chronicle form, might do to counteract the latter. To this end, I will direct my attentions towards Hervault's portrayal of the Brigade Z, an understudied special police force dressed curiously in blue boiler suits and not police uniforms, established in 1961 by Maurice Papon to quadriller the bidonville, then mushrooming around the Parisian periphery. Now, this term quadriller is used frequently by Hervault to describe the police procedures employed with intent to render legible the otherwise labyrinthine urban composition of the bidonville, numbering its barracks, the methodological gathering of information, the close surveillance of any new construction in and out of doors. All of this to better control the bidonville and its residents and to instill an atmosphere of terror and anticipation created by constant sweeps, the destruction of house lodgings, and what commonly came to be known as ratonnade. So Chronique du Bidonville gathers together entries of Herveau's eyewitness report of life in La Folie, mostly either brief snapshots anchored in a particular local event or slightly longer ethnographic observations about life and survival in La Folie. Its shortest entries consist of no more than a single line. For instance, 29 August 1959, plusieurs Algériennes arrêtées dans le bidonville, and that's it. Whereas others carry over into several page excursions, profiling residents, telling their stories, and recording their near constant high tension negotiations with the French state. Herveau's prose is almost uniformly terse, declarative, with rare intrusions from the first person. One gets the sense in reading that some observations are jotted down on the spot, in situ, lending her account an aura of immediacy. So as mentioned, I will focus on Herveau's representation of the Brigade Z, the police force tasked with containing and dismantling the bidonville from 1961 onwards. And as I see it, and this will be revisited in my following section, Herveau's account of the Brigade is important both as literal testimonial, rendering visible the Brigade's otherwise underdocumented machinations, but also may be interpreted as implicit commentary on the policing of history and historical memory. The first time the Brigade Z appeared in the Chronique is in August 1961 at a fever point in the Algerian War. Police surveillance and hard-key sweeps have intensified, and Herveau describes an atmosphere of terrified anticipation that permeates La Folie, où, as she puts it quite vividly, sévit la guerre avec ses arrestations, ses morts, ses fouilles et ses baraques défoncées, ses projecteurs illuminants sur leurs flancs croisés, les cahutes tassées les unes contre les autres. The Brigade Z is introduced into this carceral gridlock as a means to arrest further construction in the bidonville. Any sign of expansion is met with total destruction, and this includes repairs both in and outside of doors. Interior renovations are closely surveyed and may spell destruction just as much as explicit external repairs. Herveau describes barracks and wagons being torn apart with hammers or set ablaze by the Brigade, and the pain and hopelessness of those residents watching on in silence as their homes are destroyed. So Herveau pays particular attention to the Brigade's meticulous information gathering during their sweeps of the bidonville and their frightening capacity to spot its most minute alterations. Les aides déambulent tous les jours dans les ruelles, inspectent l'aspect de chaque chaque abri, pénètrent dans les cours, repèrent l'ajout d'une planche, le remplaçant d'une porte ou l'adjonction d'une ouverture, guettent le moindre coup de marteau. In addition to this routine, meticulous inspection, each and every construction was numbered by the police with the intent of logically mapping and submitting to a form of rational, systematized control the otherwise labyrinthine settlement. This is the quadrillage evoked earlier. And agents of the Brigade are distinguished from other police officers by their blue boiler suits and tall rubber boots, which lend them an ambiguous custodial appearance. Residents of La Folie famously called them les bleus instead of the police to distinguish. This ambiguity reverberates outward into popular discourse at the time, which commonly compared the bidonvilles themselves as to sites of infection or wounds upon the urban landscape. Legally, they were coded as unsalubrious zones, potentially hazardous to public health. The overlap between policing and custodial work suggested by the Brigade's appearance contributes to this imaginary association, further evidenced in the Brigade's racist treatment of La Folie's residents. One resident tells Herveau of the racist slurs that were hurled at him while the Brigade went about its work. Crouillat, sale crouillat, bougnol, sale bougnol, bico, sale bico. To each of these common slurs for North Africans, crouillat, bougnol, bico, sale is added, suggesting a triangular correlation between the bidonville, its inhabitants, and this insalubriousness, all slated as targets for custodial intervention. So I will give one of these few examples in the interest of time, but I want to think about what to make of them. And on the one hand, it is enough for Herveau to provide an eyewitness account of the bidonville and the cruelty of the protracted destruction of the Brigade Z, which otherwise tended to be overcoded in a language of urban renewal and humanitarian relocation of the bidonville's inhabitants. This counter-hegemonic historiographical work is invaluable on its own. However, I want to suggest the text formally disrupts what I will now articulate as the police conception of history, reflected in dominant national historiographical projects like Nora's Lieu de Mémoire. And this tendency is mirrored in the concrete practices of the Brigade Z, only now in terms of national memory. So for this, I want to return to Maspero's critical formulation of historical police work in his preface, Circuler, il y a rien à voir, as he puts it. This find echoes in Jacques Rancière's broader theorization of the police as a repressive socio-aesthetic ordering of what may or may not be seen in a given historical conjuncture. This is what he names the partage du sensible. Rancière, like Maspero, likens police work to a mechanics of circulation. Circuler, il y a rien à voir. La police dit qu'il n'y a rien à voir sur une chaussée, rien à faire qui circuler. Elle dit que l'espace de la circulation n'est que l'espace de la circulation. The police, in Rancière's aesthetic model, relegates a subaltern group, what he names the part sans part, those accorded no part in the belonging in the social totality, to a zone of non-appearance, a constitutive autre identity assigned at this historical point to the Algerian. This is a point that Rancière unpacks elsewhere in a text on the 1961 October massacres in Paris. And put simply, I want to suggest that Rancière's police, legitimized by the work of Nora and co, for present purposes, is tasked with a form of aesthetic quadrillage that resembles a scaled-up version of the work of the Brigade Z. And to briefly circle more concretely back to the matter of history, in her book on May 68, Kristen Ross maps Rancière's notion of the police directly onto historiography in order to account for what she names the police conception of history. This names a hegemonic mode of history writing that erases or reconfigures elements, facts, or characters that might trouble the moral foundation of its, in this case, national narrative. To my mind, the bidonvilles constitute one such troublesome element on the post-war French narrative of reconstruction and economic expansion, canonized as the Trente Glorieuses. I believe that Herveau's work too troubles his police historical framework, not only in content, but in its generic form as well. The genre of chronique is unambiguously singled in its title. It is indeed a chronicle, inscribed in a project of what we might call sort of minor historiography or history from below. A list of chronologically arranged dated events, albeit dated without any sense of overarching standardization. Some entries address an entire year, others months, and others days. Herveau does not tend to narrativize, or at least not beyond the occasional local string of successive entries. This gives the book a halting, syncopated tempo as one reads across its pages. Yet this does not render it incomplete per se. Rather, to my mind, the fragmentary quality of Herveau's account is key to communicating an analogous temporality or atmosphere of life in the bidonvilles themselves, a sense of unevenness in time, a slow, lingering tension punctuated by traumatic events that Herveau is at pains to convey. This expression, I believe, is made possible, at least in part, by the chronicle form itself. And so I think Hayden White's account of the chronicle is helpful for clearing up this point a bit. White, in his taxonomy of historiographical forms, argues that the chronicle often seems to wish to tell a story, aspires to narrativity, but typically fails to achieve it. More specifically, the chronicle usually is marked by a failure to achieve narrative closure. It does not so much conclude as simply terminate. It starts out to tell a story, but breaks off in media res, in the chronicler's own present. It leaves things unresolved, or rather, leaves them unresolved in a story-like way. And so there are key differences between White's articulation of the chronicle form in Herveau's text, namely the presence of a preface and concluding reflections which situate the work and rescue it from this in media res break. But this generic sketch taps many of the chronique's signal formal traits as well, namely its presentation as a collection of unfinished stories, as White puts it elsewhere, or again, unresolved in a story-like way. Unfinished here, again, does not mean incomplete or imperfect. For White, the chronicle, and by extension the annales, exist rather as particular products of possible conceptions of historical reality, conceptions that are alternatives to, rather than failed anticipations of, the fully realized historical discourse that the modern history form is supposed to embody, end quote. And briefly, in closing, what I'm trying to suggest here is that when routed through White's reframing of the chronicle's incompleteness, there is a way of reading the same incompleteness of Hervault's chronique against the police tendency of history writing traced through comments by Maspero, Rancière, and Ross. On the one hand, the scenes of dispossession and state violence recounted by Hervault cut against a hegemonic narrative of post-war French progress and prosperity, revealing its inner contradictions. On the other, the unfinished character of the stories that Hervault tells and the fragmentary nature of the chronicle form itself refuse easy conscription into dominant historiographical models, which privilege completeness and order and testify to an alternative model of historical reality, which contests rather than acquiesces to the police conception of history I've begun to sketch here. Thank you.